Sophia's hand shook as she dabbed concealer over the purple bruise spreading across her cheekbone. Never suspecting that her employer, a man who built his empire on making problems disappear, stood watching from the doorway with murder in his eyes. By the time she finished covering the evidence of her husband's violence, Mr. Russo had already decided Marcus would vanish from existence within the week. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The concealer wasn't covering it well enough. I tilted my face toward the bathroom mirror, studying the purple-yellow bruise that spread from my left cheekbone down toward my jaw. 3 days old now, and still angry enough that even the heavy-duty makeup I'd bought specifically for this purpose could only do so much. The foundation went on first, dabbed carefully with a damp sponge in the technique I'd learned from YouTube tutorials I never imagined I'd need. Then the concealer, 2 shades lighter than my skin tone to counteract the discoloration. Finally, powder to set it all, though I knew by mid-afternoon the edges would start to show through. My hands shook as I worked, making the application messier than usual. I'd woken at 5:30 to give myself extra time, knowing that today of all days, I couldn't afford to look anything less than perfectly composed. Mr. Russo had guests arriving at noon, important people whose names I'd overheard but couldn't repeat, and the entire household staff had been briefed on the elevated expectation. Everything had to be flawless. I had to be flawless, or at least appear that way beneath the carefully constructed mask I wore these days. The mask wasn't just makeup, though that was certainly part of it. It was the way I held my shoulders, straight but not too straight, deferential without seeming broken. It was the neutral expression I'd perfected, pleasant enough to seem approachable but not so warm that anyone would be encouraged to ask personal questions. It was the efficient silence I moved in, completing my duties with the kind of invisible competence that made people forget a human being was performing the service at all. I'd been working in the Russo household for 7 months, though it felt like longer. The estate sprawled across 12 acres in the countryside north of the city, all manicured gardens and marble fountains and windows that let in light like a cathedral. 23 rooms in the main house alone, not counting the staff quarters, the guest house, or the mysterious building near the south gate that I'd been explicitly instructed never to approach. Mr. Russo employed a full staff, 2 cooks, 3 gardeners, a driver, 2 security personnel whose presence felt more military than domestic, and me. I handled the interior cleaning, the laundry, and whatever else was needed to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury that money could buy. The pay was extraordinary, almost obscene compared to what I'd made in my previous positions. Enough that I'd been able to pay off 2 of Marcus's credit cards in the first 3 months. Enough that I'd started allowing myself to imagine a future where debt didn't crush us from every direction. But money came with expectations in the Russo household, and one of those expectations was discretion. I didn't ask questions about the men in expensive suits who arrived at odd hours, about the conversations conducted in Italian that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms, about the way Mr. Russo's security team carried themselves with the controlled readiness of people for whom violence was a professional skill. I finished with the makeup and stepped back to assess my work. Passable. Not perfect, but hopefully good enough that no one would look too closely. I pulled my dark hair back into its customary tight bun, smoothed down the black uniform dress that all female staff wore, and checked the small gold watch Marcus had given me for our 2nd anniversary. 6:45. 15 minutes to get downstairs and begin the morning routine before Mr. Russo took his breakfast at 7. The staff quarters were on the 3rd floor of the east wing. Small but comfortable rooms that felt like luxury compared to the cramped apartment Marcus and I shared in the city. I'd started spending more nights here over the past 2 months, using the excuse of early morning responsibilities and late evening events to avoid going home. Mrs. Chun, the head cook, had noticed but said nothing, her dark eyes too knowing for comfort. She'd been with Mr. Russo for 15 years and had probably seen more than she'd ever admit. The kitchen was already warm with activity when I arrived, the scent of fresh espresso and baking bread filling the air. Mrs. Chun moved between the industrial stove and the marble prep counter with practiced efficiency, while her assistant Teresa chopped vegetables for the evening meal with rhythmic precision. They both looked up when I entered, and I saw Mrs. Chun's gaze linger on my face for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral as I reached for the silver tray Mr. Russo preferred for his breakfast service. "Morning, Sophia," Mrs. Chun replied, returning her attention to the espresso machine with deliberate focus. "Mr. Russo requested the Caravaggio blend today, and he wants fresh fruit, not the usual pastries." I nodded, arranging the fine china and sterling silver on the tray with the particular precision Mr. Russo demanded. Everything in its exact place, the coffee cup at a 45-degree angle to the plate, the napkin folded into the intricate triangle that spoke of old-world elegance. I'd learned these details through careful observation and the occasional correction delivered in Mr. Russo's quiet voice that somehow carried more authority than shouting ever could. The main house felt different in the morning light, less imposing than it did during evening events when shadows gathered in corners and the chandeliers cast everything in dramatic chiaroscuro. I moved through the hallways with the silent efficiency that came from months of practice, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floors. Past the formal dining room with its table that could seat 20, past the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves holding books in 6 languages, past the gallery where original paintings worth more than most people's houses hung in climate-controlled perfection. Russo's private study was on the second floor, overlooking the eastern gardens where morning sun painted everything in shades of gold. I knocked twice, the same pattern I used every morning, and waited for his response. Enter. His voice carried the slight accent that marked him as someone who'd learned English as a second language but had long since mastered it. I pushed open the heavy oak door and found him exactly where I expected, seated at his desk, reviewing papers with the kind of focused intensity that suggested whatever he was reading mattered more than most people could imagine. He was 42, though he could have passed for younger, with the kind of face that European tailoring and expensive haircuts could only enhance, not create. Dark eyes that missed nothing, a jaw that suggested both strength and control, and hands that moved with the deliberate grace of someone comfortable with power. "Good morning, Mr. Russo," I said, setting the tray on the small table near the window where he preferred to take breakfast when working. I'd learned not to place it directly on his desk unless specifically instructed. "Sophia." He glanced up from his papers, and in that brief moment when his attention focused fully on me, I felt the weight of his observation like a physical thing. "Thank you." I turned to leave, grateful to escape before he noticed anything amiss. But his voice stopped me before I reached the door. "Wait." My heart hammered against my ribs, though I kept my expression carefully neutral as I turned back to face him. "Yes, sir?" He stood, moving around the desk with fluid grace, and I found myself taking an involuntary step backward before I could stop myself. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable, but I saw something shift in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a sharpening of attention that suggested I'd just become more than invisible staff in his awareness. "Come here," he said quietly, gesturing to the space near the window where natural light fell in clear, unforgiving brightness. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to maintain the careful distance that kept personal and professional separate, that kept my secrets safely hidden. But I'd learned in 7 months that Russo's requests, no matter how gently phrased, were never really requests at all. I crossed the room on legs that felt disconnected from my body, stopping at what I hoped was an appropriate distance. He said nothing for a long moment, simply studied my face with the kind of methodical attention that made me want to look away. But I'd learned that too, that looking away suggested guilt or deception, that the mask required meeting his gaze with calm acceptance. "When did this happen?" His voice remained quiet, conversational almost, but I heard something beneath the words that made my blood run cold. Not anger directed at me, but a different kind of fury, one that had nothing to do with breakfast service or household management. "I don't know what you mean, sir." The lie came easily, too easily, polished smooth by months of practice with Marcus's parents, with coworkers, with the woman at the grocery store who'd commented on a similar bruise 3 weeks earlier. Mr. Russo reached up slowly, telegraphing his movement with the care of someone who understood that sudden motions caused fear. His thumb traced the edge of my cheekbone, right where the makeup concealed the worst of the damage, his touch so gentle it made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When he pulled his hand away, his thumb was smudged with foundation and concealer, the evidence of my carefully constructed deception visible in the flesh-colored residue. "This," he said, showing me his thumb with quiet certainty. "When did this happen?" I should have maintained the lie, should have offered some excuse about clumsiness or accidents. Should have protected Marcus the way I'd been protecting him for the past years. His anger had escalated from words to pushing to the kind of violence that left marks requiring concealer. But something in Mr. Russo's expression, some combination of controlled fury and unexpected concern, broke through the defenses I'd built so carefully. 3 days ago, I heard myself say, the words emerging before I could stop them. "My husband and I had a disagreement about finances." The clinical phrasing felt safer than the truth, that Marcus had come home drunk at 2 in the morning, furious that I'd paid the electric bill instead of giving him money for whatever he'd needed that night, that his fist had connected with my face before I'd even fully processed what was happening, that I'd spent an hour locked in the bathroom afterward, holding ice against my cheek while he passed out on the couch, snoring as if nothing had happened. "A disagreement," Mr. Russo repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made me recognize I'd made a terrible mistake in admitting anything at all. "Your husband disagreed with you so forcefully that he left marks requiring professional-grade concealer to hide." "It's not like that," I said quickly, falling back on the familiar script of excuses I'd developed over the past year. "He's under a lot of stress. The job market has been difficult, and we have significant debt from my mother's medical treatments. Sometimes the pressure builds, and he just needs to release it." Mura Russo's expression remained unchanged, but something in his posture shifted. A coiling of tension that suggested violence held in careful check, and releasing pressure requires hitting his wife hard enough to bruise bone. The bluntness of his words cut through my practiced rationalizations, forcing me to confront the reality I'd been avoiding. When someone else said it out loud, stripped of all the careful euphemisms and contextualizing, it sounded exactly as bad as it was. "I should fire you," Mr. Russo said quietly, moving back to his desk with controlled precision. "Not because of your performance, which has been excellent, but because keeping you employed here puts you at risk. Your husband knows you work for me, knows the kind of money you earn. That makes you a target for his anger and potentially a security liability for my household. The thought of losing this job, this sanctuary, sent panic flooding through my system. "Please," I said, hating the desperation in my voice but unable to contain it. "I need this position. The money is the only thing keeping us afloat." If I lose this income, we'll lose our apartment, and Marcus will be even more stressed, and everything will get worse. Everything will get worse anyway, Mr. Russo said with the certainty of someone who'd seen this pattern play out before. Men who hit their wives don't stop because circumstances improve. They stop when they're forced to stop or when there's no longer anyone available to hit. He's not always like this, I insisted, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. When we first met, he was kind and funny and supportive. He helped me through my mother's illness and death. He encouraged me to pursue better employment opportunities. This anger is new, just in the past year since he lost his job at the manufacturing plant. Or perhaps the anger was always there, Mr. Russo suggested. Pouring himself espresso with steady hands, and circumstances simply remove the incentive to hide it. Men reveal who they truly are under pressure. Your husband has shown you his truth. The question is whether you're willing to accept it. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the windows. You don't understand. It's not that simple. We've been together for 5 years. We have shared debts, shared history. I can't just walk away from all of that because he's going through a difficult period. Can't or won't. The distinction matters, Sophia. One suggests genuine obstacles preventing action. The other suggests choice disguised as necessity. His words hung in the air between us, challenging me to examine motivations I'd been carefully avoiding. The truth was more complicated than either option suggested. I stayed because leaving required resources I didn't have, because Marcus controlled our bank accounts and I'd only recently started building separate savings from this job, because his family blamed me for his unemployment and would make my life hell if I left, because some part of me still believed the man I'd married existed underneath the angry stranger he'd become. What do you want me to do? I asked, finally meeting Mr. Russo's gaze with something approaching honesty. Leave him with nothing but the clothes on my back? Stay at a shelter where he'll find me within days? I'm trying to build enough financial security to make leaving possible, but that takes time. Time you may not have, Mr. Russo observed, setting down his espresso with careful precision. The next time he hits you, it could be worse than a bruise. The time after that could put you in a hospital or... I've seen this progression too many times to pretend it ends differently than it does. The casual mention of death sent ice through my veins. Not because the thought hadn't occurred to me, but because hearing someone else's voice, it made the danger feel suddenly terrifyingly real. Marcus's anger had been escalating, each incident worse than the last, each apology less convincing. Last week, he'd grabbed my throat hard enough to leave fingerprint bruises I'd hidden under high-neck blouses. This week it was my face. Next week it might be worse. How much money do you need to leave safely? Mr. Russo asked, pulling a leather-bound ledger from his desk drawer. Not a loan, he added before I could protest. A bonus for exceptional service and discretion. You've proven yourself invaluable to this household, and I take care of people who work for me. I can't accept that, I said automatically, though every practical instinct screamed at me to take whatever help was offered. It wouldn't be right. I haven't earned that kind of generosity. You've earned more than you realize, Mr. Russo said, his voice carrying unexpected warmth. You maintain this household with efficiency and grace. You handle confidential matters with appropriate discretion. And you've never once questioned or commented on the various unusual aspects of my business operations, which demonstrates both intelligence and wisdom. The oblique reference to his criminal connections hung in the air, unspoken but acknowledged. I'd known within my first month that Mr. Russo wasn't simply a successful businessman with inherited wealth. The security protocols, the coded conversations, and men who visited and carried themselves with the controlled violence of professional soldiers. All of it pointed to connections that existed outside legal boundaries, but knowing something and acknowledging it were different things. And I'd learned quickly that survival in the Russo household required strategic blindness to certain realities. I need approximately $15,000, I said quietly, calculating quickly in my head. Enough for first and last month's rent on a small apartment, furniture, new locks. Enough buffer to survive while I look for additional work if necessary. Maybe a used car so Marcus can't track me through public transportation. Mr. Russo wrote something in the ledger, then pulled out a checkbook from another drawer. He wrote with the same precise attention he brought to everything else, his handwriting elegant and controlled. When he finished, he held out a check for $25,000. Can't accept this, I repeated, staring at the number that represented more money than I'd earned in 2 years. This is too much. It's charity, and I don't take charity. It's not charity, Mr. Russo corrected, pressing the check into my hand with gentle insistence. It's investment. I'm investing in the continued well-being of someone valuable to me, someone whose absence would disrupt my household operations. Think of it as business strategy rather than generosity. The rationalization was thin, transparent even, but it gave me enough psychological cover to accept what I desperately needed. My fingers closed around the check, the paper feeling substantial and real in a way that made hope flicker in my chest for the first time in months. Thank you, I whispered, my voice thick with emotions I couldn't fully name. I don't know how to repay this. Continue doing your job with the same excellence you've demonstrated, Mr. Russo said, returning to his desk as if we'd just concluded a routine business transaction rather than a conversation that would change my life. And consider moving into the staff quarters full-time for the next few weeks. Your husband knows you work here but doesn't know the property layout. The security team can ensure he doesn't gain access if he comes looking for you. The offer was both protection and prison, I realized. Safety that came with increased dependence on Marusso's goodwill. But the alternative was returning to the apartment I shared with Marcus. pretending everything was fine while planning my escape, risking that he'd discover my plans before I could execute them. "I'll move my things this weekend," I said, making the decision even as anxiety twisted in my stomach. "But I need to tell Marcus something. If I just disappear, he'll report me missing or do something worse." "Leave that to me," Mr. Russo said with quiet certainty that sent chills down my spine. "I'll have a conversation with your husband about appropriate behavior and realistic expectations going forward." The casual way he mentioned having a conversation with Marcus suggested methods I didn't want to examine too closely. Whatever Massar Russo's business operations involved, they clearly included the kind of influence that made people reconsider their choices. "I should get back to work," I said, needing to escape before the weight of everything that had just happened overwhelmed my carefully maintained composure. "The guest rooms need to be prepared before your visitors arrive." "Sophia," Mr. Russo called as I reached the door. I turned back to find him studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "You did nothing to deserve what your husband has done to you. Whatever guilt or shame you're carrying, it belongs to him, not you. Remember that." The unexpected kindness in his words broke something loose inside me, tears threatening, despite my best efforts to maintain professional distance. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and fled before he could see me cry. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of mechanical efficiency. I cleaned guest rooms with hands that moved on autopilot while my mind spun through the implications of everything that had just happened. The check felt heavy in my uniform pocket, a tangible reminder that my carefully controlled life had just shifted in ways I couldn't fully predict. Mr. Russo had seen through my mask, had acknowledged the violence I'd been hiding, and instead of treating me like damaged goods or a liability, he'd offered help without judgment. The kindness was almost harder to process than the abuse had been. By noon, the estate had transformed into the kind of elegant, entertaining space that justified its reputation among Chicago's elite. Mrs. Chun had outdone herself with the lunch preparations, platters of antipasti and fresh pasta arranged with the artistic precision that made every meal in the Russo household feel like a special occasion. The dining room gleamed with fresh polished crystal glasses catching light like captured stars. Everything positioned with the exacting standards Russo demanded. The guests began arriving at 12:15, expensive cars pulling up the circular drive with the casual confidence of people for whom wealth was simply a baseline expectation. I'd learned to recognize the subtle hierarchies that played out among Mr. Russo's visitors. The way certain men commanded respect through presence alone while others deferred despite their obvious prosperity. Today's gathering included 6 men, all impeccably dressed, all carrying themselves with the controlled awareness of people who understood that violence was always an option, even if rarely exercised. I moved through the service of lunch with practiced invisibility, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates while conversations flowed around me in a mixture of English and Italian. The men discussed business with the kind of coded language I'd learned not to hear too clearly, references to territories and operations and arrangements that existed in the gray spaces between legal commerce and criminal enterprise. Mr. Russo presided over the gathering with quiet authority, his voice never rising but somehow dominating the conversation through sheer force of presence. It was during dessert service that I noticed him watching me. Not obviously, but I'd become attuned to his attention over 7 months of employment, could feel the weight of his gaze even when I wasn't directly looking. Every time I entered the dining room, his eyes would track me with an intensity that felt protective rather than predatory, assessing something beyond my ability to serve espresso without spilling. When the lunch finally concluded and the guests departed in a convoy of luxury vehicles, I began the cleanup process with Teresa, while Mrs. Chun oversaw the kitchen restoration. The older woman worked beside me in companionable silence for nearly an hour before finally speaking. "Miss Russo doesn't usually concern himself with staff personal matters," she said quietly in her lightly accented English, scrubbing a serving platter with more force than necessary. "In 15 years, I've seen him maintain perfect professional distance with everyone who works here. But today at lunch, he asked me about you. Wanted to know if I'd noticed anything concerning about your well-being." Heat crept up my neck despite my best efforts to remain composed. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Mrs. Chun said, meeting my eyes with uncomfortable directness. "That you've been coming to work with injuries you try to hide. That you've started staying here more nights than you go home. That you flinch sometimes when men raise their voices even when they're not angry. That I recognize the signs because my daughter went through something similar before her husband put her in the hospital." The revelation hung in the air between us, creating unexpected solidarity through shared experience. I'd thought my performance had been flawless, that my careful makeup and controlled demeanor had successfully maintained the illusion that everything was fine. But Mrs. Chun had seen through it all, had probably known the truth for months, and had chosen discretion until Miss Russo's questions gave her permission to acknowledge what she'd observed. "Is your daughter okay now?" I asked, needing to know that survival was possible, that women actually escaped situations like mine rather than just disappearing into statistics. "She's alive," Mrs. Chun said, which wasn't quite the same as being okay, but suggested at least the possibility of recovery. "She left California, changed her name, started over somewhere her ex-husband couldn't find her. It took years before she stopped looking over her shoulder, but she's building a life now, working as a teacher, engaged to a good man who understands what she's been through. How did she get out? Mr. Russo helped her, Mrs. Chun said simply, as if that explained everything. My daughter was working as a waitress at one of his restaurants when her husband came in and caused a scene. Mr. Russo witnessed the violence, and within a week my daughter had a new identity, a new city, and enough money to start fresh. He never asked for anything in return except that she make something of her second chance. The story offered both hope and concern, revealing that Miss Russo's protective instincts extended beyond simple employer obligations, but also suggesting that accepting his help came with unspoken expectations I couldn't fully understand. Men like him didn't offer charity without reason, didn't invest in people's well-being unless it served some larger purpose within the complex networks that governed their operations. Why would he do that for someone he barely knew? I asked, voicing the question that seemed most important. Because he understands what it means to be powerless, Mrs. Chun said, her voice carrying unexpected emotion. Mr. Russo's mother was killed by his father when he was 14 years old. Domestic violence that escalated until it became murder. He watched his father systematically destroy his mother over years, watched the authorities do nothing because his father had money and connections, watched her die because no one with power chose to intervene. The revelation recontextualized everything I thought I understood about my employer. Mr. Russo wasn't just some wealthy criminal who decided to play benefactor. He was someone whose life had been fundamentally shaped by the same kind of violence I was. Someone who'd learned that power without protection was meaningless, that money without security couldn't save the people you love. What happened to his father? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Mr. Russo handled it when he turned 18, Mrs. Chun said with the kind of careful phrasing that communicated volumes through deliberate vagueness. His father had an accident, very tragic, very permanent. And then Russo built his organization on principles that included protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, especially women trapped in violent situations. The information settled into my understanding like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Mr. Russo's reaction to my bruises hadn't been simple employer concern or even basic human decency. It had been personal, driven by trauma that had shaped his entire approach to power and protection. I represented something he'd failed to save once, and his intervention now was as much about his own demons as it was about my safety. You should accept whatever help he offers, Mrs. Chun continued, returning her attention to the dishes with renewed focus. Mr. Russo doesn't make gestures he doesn't mean, and he has resources your husband couldn't begin to comprehend. If you're planning to leave your marriage, you couldn't ask for a better ally. That evening, after the kitchen had been cleaned and the household had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythms, I sat in my small room in the staff quarters and called Marcus for the first time in 3 days. He answered on the 5th ring, his voice carrying the slurred edge that suggested he'd been drinking since afternoon. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, skipping past greetings straight to accusation. "I've been calling your cell for 2 days. I told you I had extended responsibilities this week," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Russo is hosting important guests and needs staff available at all hours." "Fuck your important guests," Marcus spat, his anger building with familiar momentum. "You think you're too good for me now, working for some rich asshole in his mansion? Think you can just ignore your husband because you're making decent money?" "I'm not ignoring you," I said, though we both knew that was exactly what I'd been doing. "I'm working. There's a difference. Working or fucking your boss." The accusation came with vicious certainty, his paranoia manifesting in the ugliest possible interpretation. "Is that why you're staying there so much? Because you're spreading your legs for better opportunities?" The words should have hurt more than they did, should have sparked the same defensive panic they'd triggered months earlier when his accusations first started. But distance and Mr. Russo's intervention had given me enough perspective to recognize the accusations as projection. Marcus's guilt and inadequacy manifesting as baseless jealousy. "I'm hanging up now," I said quietly. "When you're sober and ready to have a reasonable conversation, you can call back. You hang up on me and you'll regret it," Marcus threatened, his voice rising to a shout I could hear clearly even with the phone pulled away from my ear. "You come home right now or I'm coming to that estate and dragging you out myself. The security here won't let you on the property," I said, discovering a core of steel I hadn't known existed beneath months of conditioning to accept control. "And if you try to force your way in, you'll find yourself dealing with people who make you look like an amateur at violence." The silence that followed my words stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke again, his voice had shifted from rage to something colder and more calculating. "You think your rich boss will protect you?" Marcus said with bitter amusement. "You think because he pays you well and lets you sleep in his house that he gives a shit about you? You're just staff to him, Sophia. Replaceable. The second you become more trouble than you're worth, he'll throw you out and find someone else to clean his toilets." Maybe, I acknowledged, because there was truth in his words, even if his motivations for speaking them were poison. "But at least he's never hit me." At least when he speaks to me, it's with respect rather than contempt. At least in his house. I don't go to sleep afraid of what tomorrow morning will bring. The admission hung in the air between us, finally voicing the reality we'd both been avoiding. Our marriage wasn't troubled or stressed or going through a difficult period. It was abusive and broken and had been for longer than I'd wanted to admit. Fine, Marcus said finally, his voice carrying an edge of finality that sent warning signals through my nervous system. Stay there. Play house with your criminal boss. But remember that you're still my wife, Sophia. The threat implicit in his words kept me awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling of my small room while my mind spun through worst-case scenarios. Marcus had never been good at accepting rejection or loss of control, and our phone conversation had made it clear that he viewed my absence as both. The check from Mr. Russo sat hidden in my pillowcase, representing freedom I hadn't yet figured out how to claim safely. Leaving required more than money. It required planning, timing, and most importantly, ensuring that Marcus couldn't track me down once I disappeared. Morning came too early, dragging me from restless half-sleep into the pre-dawn darkness that preceded the household's daily routines. I showered and dressed with mechanical efficiency, applying fresh makeup over bruises that had faded enough to require less concealer but still showed purple-yellow evidence of Marcus's handiwork. The face staring back from the bathroom mirror looked older than my 32 years. Worn down by stress and fear and the constant energy required to maintain appropriate masks for different audiences. Marusso was already in his study when I arrived with his breakfast tray at 7. Surrounded by papers and speaking quietly on the phone in Italian, he gestured for me to enter without interrupting his conversation, and I set out his meal with practiced precision while trying not to listen too closely to words I couldn't fully understand but suspected involved. The kind of business that happened in shadows. When he finally ended the call, he studied me with the same assessing intensity he'd shown yesterday morning, as if cataloging changes in my appearance or demeanor that might reveal important information. Your husband called the main house number last night, he said without preamble, 4 times between 11 and 1 in the morning. My security team blocked the calls after the second attempt, but the persistence suggests escalating concern on his part about your whereabouts. Cold fear settled in my stomach despite my best efforts to remain calm. I spoke with him yesterday evening. Told him I was staying here for extended work responsibilities. And how did he respond to that information? Mr. Russo's tone suggested he already knew the answer but wanted me to articulate it myself. With threats, I admitted, sinking into the chair he gestured toward, despite my instinct to maintain professional distance. He said he'd come here to drag me home if necessary, that I was still his wife, regardless of where I chose to stay. Men like your husband view their wives as property rather than people, Mr. Russo observed, pouring espresso into 2 cups and sliding one across the desk toward me in a gesture that felt unexpectedly intimate. The legal documentation of marriage reinforces that perception, giving them a sense of ownership that persists regardless of actual relationship dynamic. I accepted the espresso gratefully, wrapping my hands around the delicate china for warmth despite the summer heat. He wasn't always like this. When we first married, he treated me as a partner. We made decisions together, supported each other's goals. The possessiveness only started after he lost his job and I became the primary earner. Financial stress reveals character rather than creating it, Mr. Russo said with the certainty of someone who'd observed this pattern many times before. Your husband's true nature was always present. Circumstances simply removed his motivation to hide it. The question now is how to ensure your safety while you extract yourself from the situation. The clinical way he discussed my marriage's dissolution should have felt cold, but instead it offered clarity I'd been lacking. Mr. Russo approached my personal crisis with the same strategic thinking he brought to business operations, analyzing problems and implementing solutions without getting tangled in the emotional complexity that had paralyzed my own decision-making. I've contacted a colleague who specializes in these transitions, MR, Russo continued, pulling a business card from his desk drawer. She runs a private security firm that helps women disappear from dangerous situations. New identities, new locations, protection during the vulnerable period when ex-partners typically escalate their attempts at control. The card read, Valentina Security Solutions, with an address in downtown Chicago and a phone number but no other identifying information. The stark simplicity suggested an organization that valued discretion over market. I can't afford private security, I said, though the check burning a hole in my pillowcase could probably cover initial consultation lead. You're not paying for it, Mr. Russo corrected. I am. Consider it an extension of the employment benefits package. I take care of people who work for me, especially when their well-being has been compromised by circumstances beyond their control. The generosity should have made me suspicious. Should have triggered warnings about men who offered help with hidden strings attached. But Mrs. Chun's story about her daughter suggested that Mr. Russo's interventions came from genuine trauma-driven conviction rather than manipulation. He'd failed to save his mother from his father's violence, and he'd spent the subsequent decades ensuring that failure never repeated itself in his sphere of influence. Why are you doing this? I asked, needing to understand his motivations even if the answer made me uncomfortable. You barely know me beyond my ability to clean rooms and serve meals efficiently. Why invest this kind of money and resources in helping helping me escape my marriage. Mr. Russo set down his espresso with careful precision, his expression shifting to reveal something raw beneath his usual composed exterior. Because I watched my mother die slowly over years while everyone who could have helped chose not to intervene. Because I learned that power without purpose is meaningless, and that protecting people who can't protect themselves is the only use of authority worth pursuing. And because you remind me of her, if I'm being honest, the way you try to hide injuries with makeup, the way you make excuses for inexcusable behavior, the way you've convinced yourself that survival equals success. The unexpected vulnerability in his admission created intimacy that transcended employer-employee boundaries. This wasn't just Mr. Russo offering assistance to staff in need. This was a man confronting his own demons through proxy intervention, trying to save me in ways he'd been unable to save his mother. I don't know how to thank you, I said quietly, emotions threatening to overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Russo replied, his voice returning to its usual controlled authority. The process of leaving will be difficult and potentially dangerous. Your husband won't accept your departure gracefully, and the period immediately after leaving is when women face the highest risk of serious violence or death from their partner. We need to be strategic, methodical, and prepared for escalation. The clinical assessment of danger ahead should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, having someone acknowledge the reality of my situation without minimizing or romanticizing it felt almost comforting. Mr. Russo understood that leaving Marcus wasn't simply a matter of walking away. It required planning and protection and acceptance that the easy path didn't exist. What happens next? I asked, ready to follow whatever guidance would lead me towards safety. First, you meet with Valentina tomorrow morning, Mr. Russo said, pulling out his phone to make notes. She assessed your situation and develop a comprehensive exit strategy. Second, we move the money I gave you into an account your husband can't access or trace. Third, we begin establishing the infrastructure for your new life, documentation, housing, employment references. Everything you'll need to disappear completely. And Marcus? What happens when he realizes I'm not coming back? That, Mr. Russo said with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever, is where my personal involvement becomes relevant. Your husband will receive a visit from associates of mine who will explain very clearly the consequences of attempting to find you or interfere with your new life. Most men respond appropriately to that kind of direct communication. The casual mention of threatening Marcus should have bothered me more than it did, should have triggered ethical concerns about using violence or intimidation to solve personal problems. But months of living with Marcus's escalating abuse had eroded my attachment to neat moral categories. If threatening him kept him away from me, kept me safe enough to build a life free from fear, then I found myself more grateful than guilty about Mr. Russo's proposed intervention. When will this visit happen? I asked, needing to know the timeline for when my carefully controlled situation would explode into open conflict. After you've safely relocated, Mr. Russo said. We don't want to provoke him while you're still within reach. Once Valentina has you established somewhere secure, my people will ensure your husband understands the new reality and his very limited options within it. The efficiency of his planning suggested this wasn't the first time he'd orchestrated someone's escape from domestic violence. Mirza, Chun's daughter, had been one beneficiary of his intervention, but I suspected there were others. Women whose lives had been saved by Mr. Russo's particular combination of resources and ruthlessness. I spent the rest of the day in a fog of anxious anticipation, completing my duties with mechanical precision while my mind raced ahead to imagine futures I'd barely dared to consider. A life without Marcus, without constant vigilance about his moods and triggers, without the exhausting performance of pretending everything was fine when nothing was fine. The possibility felt both terrifying and intoxicating. Freedom I'd convinced myself I didn't deserve or couldn't achieve suddenly within reach. That evening I was folding linens in the second-floor hallway when raised voices drew my attention to Mr. Russo's study. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see him standing near his desk, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid Italian that even without translation conveyed fury barely held in check. His free hand gripped the edge of his desk with white-knuckled intensity, and the careful control he usually maintained had cracked enough to reveal the dangerous man beneath the elegant businessman facade. I should have moved away, should have respected his privacy and returned to my duties. But something in his tone triggered protective instinct I hadn't known I possessed. Concern for the man who'd shown me more genuine care in 2 days than my husband had demonstrated in 5 years of marriage. I found myself frozen in the hallway, listening to one-sided conversation I couldn't fully understand but recognized as significant. When Miss Russo finally ended the call, he stood motionless for several seconds before his fist slammed into the desk with enough force that I heard wood crack from my position in the hallway. The violence of the gesture, so unlike his usual controlled demeanor, sent my heart racing with a fear that felt different from what Marcus inspired. This wasn't unpredictable rage directed at me. This was fury aimed at something or someone else, controlled enough not to spiral but intense enough to break through his carefully maintained composure. I must have made some sound, a sharp intake of breath or shift of fabric. because his head snapped toward the door with predatory focus. Our eyes met across the space, and for a heartbeat I saw past the elegant businessman to the dangerous man beneath, someone for whom violence was tool rather than loss of control, someone who'd built an empire on the kind of power that didn't require raising his voice to be absolutely terrifying. "Sophia," he said, his voice carefully modulated back to normalcy despite the tension still visible in his shoulders. "How long have you been standing there?" "I just arrived," I lied, clutching the folded linens against my chest like a shield. I heard raised voices and wanted to make sure everything was all right. He studied me for a long moment, clearly debating whether to believe my explanation or call out the obvious falsehood. "Everything is fine," he said finally, though we both knew that wasn't true. "Business complications requiring attention. Nothing that concerns you." The dismissal should have been my cue to leave, to return to my duties and maintain appropriate boundaries between employer and staff. Instead, I found myself stepping into his study, setting down the linens on a nearby chair with deliberate care. "You've been very kind to me over the past 2 days," I said, choosing words carefully. "You've offered help I desperately need and asked nothing in return. If there's anything I can do to assist with whatever's troubling you, please let me know." Something shifted in his expression. Surprised perhaps that I would offer reciprocal support when most people in my position would simply accept his generosity and maintain distance. "What makes you think I need assistance?" "Because you just put your fist through a very expensive desk," I observed, gesturing toward the splintered wood visible where his hand had connected. "Because your knuckles are bleeding, and because in 7 months of working for you, I've never seen you lose control like that. Whatever news you received on that phone call, it was bad enough to crack your usual composure." Mr. Russo glanced down at his hand as if noticing the damage for the first time. Blood seeping from split knuckles where impacted torn skin. The injury should have concerned him more than it appeared to, but he regarded it with the detached interest of someone for whom physical pain registered as inconvenience rather than genuine distress. "My younger sister has gotten herself into a situation requiring intervention," he said after a long pause, moving to pour whiskey from a crystal decanter. "She married a man I advised against, ignored my concerns about his background and character, and now finds herself trapped in circumstances she can't escape without help." The parallel to my own situation wasn't lost on either of us. Domestic violence, I guessed, recognizing the pattern even in his deliberately vague phrasing. "Among other complications, Mr. Russo confirmed, taking a long swallow of whiskey before setting down the glass with careful precision. "Her husband has connections to organizations hostile to my family's interests. Whether that was his intention from the beginning or an opportunistic development after the marriage, I'm not certain. Either way, her safety and the security of my operations have become entangled in ways that make extraction complicated." "Where is she now?" I asked, understanding dawning that his sister's situation was far more dangerous than my own. Marcus was abusive and controlling, but he didn't have connections to criminal organizations capable of threatening someone like Mr. Russo. "In Milan, hiding at a friend's apartment while her husband searches for her. She managed to escape 3 days ago after he put her in the hospital with broken ribs and a concussion. My contacts in Italy are working to get her out of the country, but her husband has people watching airports and train stations. Every hour she remains in Milan increases the risk that she'll be found." The raw emotion in his voice as he described his sister's predicament revealed depths to Miss Maruso I'd never glimpsed in our previous interaction. This wasn't the controlled businessman or the dangerous crime boss. This was a brother terrified for his sibling's safety. Someone who understood intimately what could happen to women trapped in violent marriages because he'd witnessed it with his mother. "Can you get her out?" I asked, though I suspected he'd already exhausted obvious options before reaching his current state of controlled panic. "I'm working on it," he said, refilling his whiskey glass with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, "but the situation requires delicate maneuvering. Her husband's family has significant influence in northern Italy. Moving against them too aggressively could spark a war that would endanger more than just my sister, but waiting for diplomatic solutions gives him more time to find her." The impossible calculus of his position settled over the room like heavy fog. Act too quickly and risk broader conflict that could cost multiple lives. Wait too long and risk losing his sister to the same kind of violence that had killed his mother. No wonder his control had cracked badly enough to put his fist through furniture. "What if someone went to get her who wasn't obviously connected to you?" I suggested, the idea forming even as I spoke. "Someone your enemies wouldn't recognize as one of your people who could travel to Milan as a tourist and help her leave the country without triggering alarm." Mr. Russo turned to study me with sharp attention, calculation replacing despair in his storm-gray eyes. "Someone like who?" "Someone like me," I said, commitment solidifying even though rational thought screamed warnings about getting involved in international criminal conflicts. "I have a valid passport from that trip to France I took before my mother got sick. I could book a flight to Milan as a tourist, meet your sister at whatever location you arrange, and help her travel to somewhere safe. Her husband's people are looking for Italian women fleeing. They're probably not watching for American tourists on vacation." The silence that followed my suggestion stretched long enough that I began to regret speaking at all. This wasn't my problem to solve. wasn't my fight to join. I was a domestic worker trying to escape my own abusive marriage, not some international operative capable of extracting women from dangerous situations in foreign countries. That's an insane idea, Mr. Russo said finally, though his tone suggested he was seriously considering it despite the obvious lunacy. You have no training for this kind of operation. You don't speak Italian beyond basic phrases. You've never been involved in anything remotely resembling extraction work. I also have no obvious connection to you, I countered, pressing the argument despite my own reservations. Your sister's husband is looking for women with ties to your family. I'm staff he probably doesn't even know exists. I could walk right past his surveillance because I'm nobody important in your organization. Until something goes wrong and you end up in an Italian hospital or worse, Mr. Russo said, but I could hear him working through logistics even as he voiced objections. The plan has merit in its simplicity, but the risk to you is unacceptable. More unacceptable than watching your sister die because you couldn't find a way to save her. The bluntness of my question hung in the air between us, forcing him to confront the choice he was really making. You've offered to help me escape my situation despite barely knowing me beyond professional interaction. Let me return the favor. Let me help you save your sister the way you're helping me save myself. His expression revealed a dozen different emotions cycling too quickly to fully identify, landing finally on something that looked like reluctant respect mixed with genuine concern. If I agree to this, and I'm not saying I am, you would follow my instructions exactly. No improvisation, no heroic gestures, no deviation from the plan. You do exactly what I tell you, exactly when I tell you to do it. I understand, I said, though I suspected neither of us fully believed I could maintain that kind of disciplined obedience if circumstances deteriorated. And if something goes wrong, if you're caught or compromised, you tell them nothing about me or my operation. You claim you were a tourist who befriended my sister online and offered to help her leave an abusive marriage. You maintain that story regardless of what incentives they offer for information. The casual mention of incentives that would obviously include torture sent ice through my veins, but I nodded agreement anyway. Some part of me recognized that this decision was insane, that I was offering to risk my life for a woman I'd never met to help a man who was technically my employer and nothing more. But another part understood that this was how I could balance the ledger, how I could transform from helpless victim accepting charity into someone capable of agency and action. When would I leave? I asked, making the commitment real through practical planning. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Russo said, pulling out his phone to begin making arrangements. I'll have Valentina meet with you tonight instead of tomorrow to expedite the security briefing. She'll provide documentation and cover story, establish your credentials as a tourist, arrange local contacts in Milan who can support the operation without being obviously connected to my family. The rapid shift from theoretical discussion to operational planning made everything suddenly terrifyingly real. In less than 24 hours, I would be on a plane to Italy to extract a woman from a dangerous situation I barely understood. The insanity of what I'd just agreed to threatened to overwhelm my courage, but I forced myself to maintain composure. What about Marcus? I asked, practical concerns surfacing despite the larger crisis. If I'm leaving the country, he might see that as an opportunity to cause problems here. Marcus will be occupied with other concerns, Mr. Russo said with the kind of cold certainty that suggested plans were already in motion. I'm moving up the timeline for my associate's conversation with him. By the time you leave for the airport tomorrow, your husband will have received very clear communication about boundaries and consequences. The clinical way he discussed threatening Marcus should have bothered me more than it did, but I found myself grateful rather than concerned, relieved that someone with actual power was willing to protect me in ways the legal system never had. Whatever Mr. Russo's people said to Marcus, it would carry weight that restraining orders and police reports never could. Valentina arrived at the estate that evening driving a nondescript sedan that looked like any other vehicle you'd pass on the highway without a second glance. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 30s, with the kind of athletic build that suggested military or law enforcement background. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp with assessment as she evaluated me in the entrance hall, cataloging details I couldn't begin to guess at. Mr. Russo tells me you volunteered for extraction work, he said without preamble as we settled in a secure room on the estate's ground floor. Her accent carried hints of Eastern Europe, something Slavic I couldn't place precisely. That's either very brave or very stupid, I haven't decided which yet. Probably both, I admitted, appreciating her directness more than false reassurance. But Russo needs help getting his sister out of Milan, and I'm in a position to provide it without obvious connection to his organization. Valentina pulled a leather portfolio from her bag and spread documents across the table between us. Your cover identity is Rachel Morrison, art history teacher from Boston on summer vacation, exploring Italian Renaissance sites. You'll fly into Milan tomorrow morning. Stay at the Hotel Principe di Savoia for 3 nights. Visit appropriate tourist destinations and happen to encounter Isabella Russo at a cafe in the Brera district on day 2. The precision of the planning was both impressive and intimidating. How do you know she'll be at that specific cafe? Because I'll tell her to be there, Valentina said with a slight smile. Isabella and I have been coordinating her movements since she went into hiding. She trusts me enough to follow instructions, makes this operation viable. The challenge is moving her from Milan to Switzerland without triggering alerts from her husband's surveillance network. Why Switzerland? I asked, trying to understand the broader strategy she? Because Geneva has infrastructure that makes disappearing easier than most places, Valentina. Pulling up maps on her tablet. M.R. Russo has established resources there. Safe houses and legal representation and documentation service. Once Isabella crosses the Swiss border, she'd be untouchable regardless of her husband's connections in Italy. And my role is just to get her out of Milan without anyone noticing. Your role is to be a concerned American tourist who befriended an Italian woman in distress and offered to help her travel to safety, Valentina correct. You don't know about her family connections or her husband's criminal association. You're just a kind person doing what you think is right. That ignorance is essential to the cover story if anything goes wrong. The emphasis on if anything goes wrong sent fresh anxiety through my system, but I forced myself to focus on practical preparation rather than spiraling into panic. What do I need to know about Isabella? How will I recognize her? Valentina slid a photograph across the table. Isabella Russo was beautiful in a way that transcended conventional prettiness, with dark eyes that held intelligence and pain in equal measure. Even in the casual photo, obviously taken without her knowledge, she carried herself with the kind of grace that suggested expensive education and careful upbringing. She looks like him, I observed, seeing Mr. Russo's features reflected in feminine form, the same sharp cheekbones and intense gaze. They're very close, Valentina said softly. Isabella's situation is destroying him in ways that business crises never could. He blames himself for not preventing her marriage, for not intervening earlier when the abuse started, for every failure to protect her from her own choices. The revelation added emotional weight to what I'd already agreed to do. This wasn't just about extracting a woman from danger. It was about saving Miss Russo from the guilt that would consume him if his sister met the same fate as his mother. We spent the next 4 hours reviewing every detail of the operation. The specific cafe where I'd meet Isabella, the route we'd take to the Swiss border, the cover story about spontaneous road trip to Lake Como that would explain our movements if questioned, the emergency contacts I should use if things deteriorated, the precise wording I should employ if caught to minimize legal and political complications. You'll have a phone with encrypted communication, Valentina explained, showing me a device that looked like any tourist's smartphone. Check in every 6 hours with simple message. Smiley face emoji means everything is progressing normally. Neutral face means minor complications but situation under control. Frowning face means abort and extract yourself immediately. The simplicity of the system was elegant, reducing complex operational status to easily transmitted symbols that wouldn't trigger surveillance algorithms monitoring communications. What happens if I send the frowning face? I asked, needing to understand my exit strategy. Then you leave Isabella, return to your hotel and catch the first flight back to the States, Valentina said with uncomfortable bluntness. Your safety takes priority over mission success. Mr. Russo was very clear about that parameter. You're not expendable in service of his family's interests. The unexpected consideration for my well-being from a man I barely knew created complicated emotions I didn't have time to process. We continued through contingency planning until nearly midnight, by which point my brain felt stuffed with information I wasn't sure I could retain under pressure. Get some rest, Valentina advised as she prepared to leave. You'll need to be alert tomorrow. Milan isn't as dangerous as some places, but Isabella's husband has made it hostile territory for anyone connected to the Russo family. Stay aware of your surroundings, trust your instincts, and don't try to be heroic if things go wrong. After she departed, I found myself too wired to sleep despite exhaustion pulling at my bones. I sat in my room reviewing the documents Valentina had provided, memorizing details about Rachel Morrison's fictional life until the cover story felt more real than my own history. Somewhere in that process of assuming another identity, I realized I'd been doing something similar for months with Marcus, performing the role of devoted wife while the actual person I'd been slowly disappeared beneath layers of fear and accommodation. A soft knock at my door interrupted my thoughts around 2 a.m. I opened it to find Mr. Russo standing in the hallway, still fully dressed despite the late hour. He looked exhausted in a way I'd never seen before. The careful control that usually characterized his demeanor worn thin by hours of stress. I wanted to thank you, he said quietly, careful not to wake other staff sleeping in nearby room. What you're doing for my sister, for me, goes far beyond any reasonable expectation of employee loyalty. I'm not doing it as your employee, I said, stepping aside to let him enter my small room. I'm doing it because you helped me when you didn't have to, because you saw my situation and intervened instead of looking away, because saving your sister feels like the only way to repay what you've given me. He moved to the window, staring out at the estate's darkened grounds with the kind of distant focus that suggested he was seeing something far beyond the immediate landscape. My mother used to say that kindness creates debts that can only be repaid with more kindness. That generosity compounds like interest until eventually everyone in a community benefits from the original gift. She sounds like she was a wise woman, I said, moving to stand beside him at the window. She was brilliant and compassionate and utterly wasted on my father, Mr. Russo said with bitter regret. She could have been anything, accomplished anything, if she hadn't married a man who viewed her intelligence as threat and her compassion as weakness. By the time she realized what she'd married into, escape was no longer possible. The parallel between his mother's situation and my own hung unspoken but acknowledged between us. We were all trapped in our different ways by choices made before we fully understood their further implication, by legal and social structures that made leaving harder than staying, by the simple calculus that freedom sometimes required more courage than survival. I won't let what happened to your mother happen to your sister, I promised, making a commitment I wasn't entirely certain I could keep but needed a voice anyway. He turned to look at me directly, and in the dim light filtering through the window I saw vulnerability in his expression that his usual composure carefully concealed. I know you'll do everything possible, but Sophia, if the situation becomes dangerous, if there's a choice between your safety and completing the mission, I need you to choose yourself. Isabella would never forgive me if you were hurt trying to help her. I would never forgive myself. The admission hung in the air between us, creating intimacy that transcended the professional relationship we'd maintained for 7 months. This wasn't employer and staff anymore. This was two people bound by shared trauma and mutual protection, recognizing in each other the damage that violence left behind and the determination to prevent it from continuing. Before I could fully process what was happening, Mr. Russo's hand had reached up to cup my face with unexpected gentleness, his thumb tracing the fading bruise on my cheekbone with a touch that made my breath catch in my throat. The gesture was intimate without being sexual, protective without being possessive, a promise of safety that I'd been craving without knowing how to articulate. When I returned from Milan, I said softly, "We need to have a serious conversation about boundaries and appropriate employee-employee dynamics." His smile was slight but genuine, warming his usually controlled features. "When you return from Milan, I suspect appropriate boundaries will be the least of our concern." He left shortly after, disappearing back into the darkened hallway while I stood at my window trying to make sense of emotions I'd been suppressing for months. Attraction to Mr. Russo wasn't new exactly. I'd felt it in subtle ways since I started working here, in the flutter of nervousness when he requested my service and the hyper-awareness I experienced in his presence. But acknowledging those feelings while still legally married to Marcus had felt like betrayal, even though my marriage had been dead long before bruises started appearing on my skin. Morning came too quickly, dragging me from restless dreams into the sharp reality of what I'd agreed to attempt. I showered and dressed in the clothes Valentina had provided, designer casual that screamed tourist with money to spend on vacation. The woman staring back from the bathroom mirror looked different from the domestic worker who'd arrived at this estate 7 months earlier. Confident, purposeful, someone capable of international extraction operations even if she'd never attempted anything remotely similar before. Mrs. Chun had prepared a substantial breakfast, her knowing eyes suggesting she understood more about my impending journey than anyone had explicitly told her. She pressed a small package into my hands as I prepared to leave. "For luck," she said simply, "and for my daughter who you're helping in ways you don't fully understand." Inside the package was a delicate gold chain with a small medallion, St. Christopher, patron saint of travelers. I fastened it around my neck, feeling the weight of other people's hopes and fears settling onto my shoulders alongside my own. Russo waited by the car that would take me to the airport, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension visible in his posture. The documents and phone were in a leather bag, my cover identity complete down to credit cards and tourist guidebooks with carefully placed bookmark. "Remember who you're pretending to be," Mr. Russo said as I settled into the back seat. "Rachel Morrison is confident, educated, completely unaware of the dangerous world she's walking into. She's helping a new friend escape domestic violence because it's the right thing to do. Nothing more complicated than that." "I understand," I said, though understanding and executing were vastly different challenges. He leaned into the car, his hand finding mine with surprising warmth. "And Sophia, be safe. My sister's important, but you've become important too in ways I'm still figuring out how to articulate. Don't take unnecessary risks trying to be heroic." Before I could respond, he'd closed the door and the car was moving down the estate's long driveway toward whatever waited me in Milan. I watched the grounds disappear in the rearview mirror, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake volunteering for operations far beyond my experience or capabilities. The flight to Milan was interminable despite lasting only 9 hours. I sat in business class thanks to Rachel Morrison's fictional art history teacher's salary, surrounded by actual tourists excited about their Italian adventures while I mentally reviewed extraction protocols and emergency procedures. Every time the plane hit turbulence, my stomach lurched with anxiety that had nothing to do with flying and everything to do with what I'd agreed to attempt once we landed. Milan's Malpensa airport was chaos in the way that all international hubs are. Crowds flowing through customs with the resigned patience of people accustomed to bureaucratic delays. I moved through with Rachel Morrison's confident, my American passport receiving cursory examination before I was waved through into the arrivals area where private car services waited with printed signs. The Hotel Principe di Savoia was exactly as elegant as Valentina had promised, all marble and crystal and the kind of understated luxury that announced itself through quality rather than ostentation. My room overlooked the city with views that should have been breathtaking but barely registered through my anxiety. I unpacked Rachel Morrison's carefully curated wardrobe, sent the required smiley face emoji to confirm safe arrival, and tried to sleep despite jet lag and nervous energy making rest impossible. Day 1 in Milan was pure tourist performance. I visited the Duomo Cathedral with appropriate awe, took photos like any American would, ate lunch at a cafe Valentina had recommended for its strategic positioning near Isabella's hiding location. The whole time I maintained hypervigilance, watching for surveillance that might indicate Isabella's husband had resources deployed more broadly than expected. But if his people were watching, they blended perfectly into Milan's cosmopolitan crowds. The afternoon brought my first glimpse of the darker undercurrents beneath Milan's fashionable surface. I was walking through the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II, admiring the architecture while maintaining cover, when I noticed two men who appeared in 3 different locations over the span of an hour. Expensive suits, deliberate positioning, the kind of coordinated movement that suggested professional surveillance rather than coincidental tourism. I sent a neutral face emoji to Valentina and received immediate response. Acknowledge. Continue normal activity. They're watching multiple potential contacts, not specifically you. The reassurance did little to calm my racing heart, but I forced myself to maintain Rachel Morrison's oblivious tourist persona. Shopping for souvenirs I'd never use and stopping for espresso at sidewalk cafes while mentally cataloging the men's appearances and movement patterns. Evening brought unexpected contact. I was reviewing Italian Renaissance art books in my hotel room, maintaining cover even in private, when my encrypted phone buzzed with message from unknown number. Tomorrow afternoon cafe meeting moved to morning, 10 a.m. instead of 2 p.m. Situation becoming unstable. Be ready to move quickly. The change in plans sent adrenaline spiking through my system. Valentina had been explicit about maintaining the original timeline, suggesting this modification came from urgent developments I couldn't control. I sent confirmation and spent the next several hours running through contingencies, trying to prepare for a mission that was already deviating from planned parameters. Sleep remained elusive despite exhaustion. I lay in expensive hotel sheets watching dawn light gradually illuminate Milan's skyline, trying to quiet anxiety that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. Somewhere in this city, Isabella Russo was hiding from a husband whose violence had escalated beyond what she could survive, and in a few hours, I would meet her and attempt to facilitate her escape using skills I didn't possess and courage I wasn't certain I could maintain. The cafe Valentina had designated was in the Brera district, tucked into a quiet street where tourists mixed with locals in the kind of authentic atmosphere guidebooks always promised but rarely delivered. I arrived early, claiming a corner table with clear sightlines to both the entrance and the street beyond. Rachel Morrison ordered cappuccino and a pastry, opening her guidebook to the section on nearby galleries while maintaining peripheral awareness of everyone entering. Isabella arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, moving with the careful grace of someone accustomed to being watched, but trying not to appear paranoid. She was more beautiful than her photograph suggested, but also more fragile, dark circles under her eyes speaking to sleepless nights and constant fear. She scanned the cafe with quick efficiency before her gaze found mine and held for a fraction of a second, recognition and desperate hope flickering across her features. She ordered at the counter, spoke to the barista in rapid Italian, then carried her espresso to my table with the casualness of someone asking to share space in a crowded cafe, rather than initiating carefully orchestrated extraction. "Excuse me," she said in accented but fluent English. "Are you American? I couldn't help but notice your guidebook and I'm so desperate to practice my English." "Of course," I replied with Rachel Morrison's friendly openness. "I'm always happy to chat. Please sit." The performance was flawless, 2 women striking up conversation in a cafe, discussing tourism and art and the various challenges of navigating Italian culture as outsiders. Anyone watching would see nothing suspicious, just pleasant strangers passing time over coffee. But beneath the surface conversation, we were conducting entirely different communication through careful word choices Valentina had programmed us to recognize. "I'm visiting from Boston," I said, emphasizing the city name that signaled I was the contact she'd been told to expect. "How wonderful," Isabella replied, her relief visible in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. "I've always wanted to visit Boston. The art museums there are supposed to be extraordinary." The keyword museums confirmed her identity and readiness to proceed with extraction. We continued our pleasant tourist conversation for another 20 minutes. establishing rapport that would justify the spontaneous friendship we were about to announce to anyone investigating our movements later. When Isabella suggested we visit the Pinacoteca di Brera together, I agreed with enthusiasm that masked the tension coiling in my stomach. We paid our bills, gathered our thing, and stepped out into Milan's summer morning like two tourists, without concerns beyond art appreciation and cultural enrichment. The gallery was crowded with visitors, providing cover as we moved through. Renaissance paintings with appropriate interest, while Isabella updated me in quick whispers during moments of relative privacy. "My husband's people know I'm in Milan," she said quietly, pretending to examine a Caravaggio while speaking low enough that only I could hear. "They found the friend who was hiding me. She's safe," she managed to warn me before they arrived, but they're expanding their search. We have maybe 24 hours before they locate me, possibly less. The timeline compression made my pulse race with fresh anxiety. Valentina's plan had assumed we'd have 3 days to establish cover before attempting border crossing. 24 hours meant improvising elements that should have been carefully choreographed. "Can you be ready to leave tonight instead of tomorrow?" I asked, studying a different painting entertaining while maintaining the appearance of casual art discussion. I've been ready to leave since the moment I escaped, Isabella said with quiet intensity. Everything I need fits in a small backpack. I can walk away from this city with nothing but the clothes I'm wearing and feel only relief. The depth of desperation in her voice reminded me of my own situation with Marcus. That particular exhaustion that came from constant vigilance and fear. Isabella and I were sisters in trauma, even if we'd never met before today, bound by the universal experience of loving men who'd transformed from partners into predators. We spent another hour at the gallery establishing the kind of connection that would justify spontaneous travel plans before returning to the cafe where we'd first met. Over lunch, speaking in voices pitched to carry to nearby tape, we enthusiastically discussed taking a road trip to Lake Como, checking into hotels there rather than Milan, spending a few days exploring the lake region before I returned to the States. The cover story was perfect in its simplicity, explaining our movements in ways that wouldn't immediately trigger alerts from surveillance watching for women fleeing toward Switzerland. We were just tourists being tourists, making impulsive decisions about itinerary adjustments. Nothing threatening about that. I'll meet you at the Stazione Centrale at 6 p.m., I said as we parted ways. We can rent a car there and drive north before dark. Isabella nodded, her eyes holding gratitude that made my chest tighten with determination. Thank you, she said quietly. My brother told me you were brave. He was right. After she left, I returned to my hotel and sent the neutral face emoji, indicating complications but nothing requiring immediate extraction. Valentina's response came quickly with updated protocols for accelerated timeline, adjusted routes that accounted for increased surveillance, emergency contacts positioned along our path to the border. The afternoon crawled past with agonizing slowness. I packed Rachel Morrison's belongings with methodical care, checked out of the hotel with appropriate regret about cutting my stay short, and made my way to Milano Centrale. The train station was exactly the kind of chaotic hub where two women could meet without drawing attention. Crowds flowing in every direction with the purposeful energy of people trying to catch connections or find platforms. I arrived 20 minutes early, positioning myself near the car rental counter with clear views of the main entrance and the platforms beyond. My phone felt heavy in my pocket, the encrypted device representing my only lifeline to support if everything went wrong. Isabella appeared at 5:55, moving through the crowds with studied casualness that couldn't quite conceal the tension in her shoulders. She'd changed clothes since our lunch meeting, now wearing jeans and a simple black jacket that made her look younger and less conspicuous. A small backpack hung from one shoulder, apparently containing everything she'd decided to keep from her old life. The minimalism of her escape broke my heart in ways I couldn't fully process while maintaining operational focus. Ready? I asked when she reached me, keeping my voice light and friendly for any observers. More than ready, she replied, and in those 3 words I heard echoes of my own desperation to escape circumstances that had become unbearable. The car rental process took longer than expected, the agent insisting on reviewing insurance options and upgrade opportunities with the kind of thorough sales approach that felt maddening given our timeline. But Rachel Morrison maintained patient enthusiasm, eventually driving away in a practical sedan that would blend perfectly into traffic heading north toward the lakes. We were 30 minutes outside Milan when I noticed the tail, a dark SUV that had been 3 cars back since we left the city, maintaining consistent distance through traffic patterns that should have created more separation. I took 2 unnecessary exits and 1 illogical route adjustment, and the SUV followed every deviation without hesitation. We have a problem, I said quietly, checking the rearview mirror again to confirm what I already knew. Black SUV, 3 cars back. They've been following us since we left Milano Centrale. Isabella twisted to look, her face draining of color as recognition flashed across her features. That's one of my husband's vehicles. He keeps a fleet of them, all identical, so his men can coordinate movements without being obvious. How did they find us so quickly? I asked, though the answer didn't matter as much as figuring out how to lose them. They must have been watching the station, waiting for me to run, Isabella said, her voice tight with fear. My husband knows I don't have money for flights or trains. He knows I'd try to find someone with a car who could help me leave. We walked right into surveillance he probably established days ago. The admission that we'd been compromised from the start sent adrenaline flooding my system, but I forced myself to maintain control. Panic wouldn't help, and Valentina had prepared contingencies for exactly this scenario. I pulled out the encrypted phone and sent the frowning face emoji, indicating we needed immediate extraction support. Quote, the response came within seconds. Continue north. Coordinates to emergency safe house uploading now. Help will intercept pursuit. I handed the phone to Isabella so she could navigate while I focused on driving, pushing the rental car faster than was probably wise on unfamiliar roads, but not fast enough to obviously signal that we knew we were being followed. The landscape blurred past, rolling hills and small villages that would have been beautiful if I'd had any attention to spare for scenery. The SUV behind us was closing distance now, apparently done with pretense of casual following. I could see 2 men in the front seats, their posture suggesting professional operation rather than random thugs. These were the kind of people Isabella's husband employed for serious work, and their presence meant our situation had escalated from surveillance to active pursuit. Turn left in 1 kilometer, Isabella said, her voice shaking as she read coordinates from the phone. The safe house is 15 kilometers north. small village called Managio on Lake Como. The left turn took us onto a smaller road, 2 lanes winding through countryside that grew increasingly rural. The SUV followed without hesitation, close enough now that I could see the driver speaking into a phone, probably coordinating with additional units. We were being herded, I realized, pushed toward whatever trap Isabella's husband had arranged. "How many people does your husband have in Italy?" I asked, needing to understand the scope of resources arrayed against us. "Dozens in Milan alone," Isabella said, her hands gripping the phone with white-knuckled intensity. "More throughout the north. He has connections to organized crime families that go back 3 generations. My brother's powerful, but here in Italy my husband has home advantage." The honesty about our disadvantaged position should have been terrifying, but somehow it clarified thinking. We couldn't outrun unlimited resources on unfamiliar territory. Our only advantage was that Valentina had planned for exactly this contingency, had positioned support along our route specifically because pursuit was always likely. The safe house emerged from the landscape with surprising suddenness. A stone villa tucked into hillside overlooking the lake. I pulled into the gravel driveway with enough speed to spray rocks, and before we'd even stopped moving, 2 men had emerged from the building with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested military training. Out of the car now, one of them commanded in accented English, "Leave everything. We move immediately." We abandoned the rental car and followed them toward a second vehicle hidden behind the villa, a nondescript van that could carry multiple passengers. The first man was already on his phone speaking rapid Italian, while the second hustled us into the van with efficient gentleness. The SUV appeared at the end of the driveway just as we pulled away from the villa, taking a service road that wound through vineyards toward the lake. I twisted in my seat to watch our pursuit, seeing 3 men exit the SUV and begin coordinating their own chase. "How far to the Swiss border?" I asked, directing the question to our new protectors. 45 kilometers if we use the main crossing," the driver replied, navigating the narrow service road with practiced skill. "But that checkpoint will be watched. We take mountain route instead, slower, but less obvious. 2 hours if we're not intercepted." 2 hours of driving through Italian countryside while being hunted by organized crime resources felt impossible, but I forced myself to trust the extraction team's expertise. They'd done this before, had experience I couldn't match, and our survival depended on following their protocols. Xevala sat beside me in the back of the van, her whole body trembling despite obvious efforts to maintain composure. I reached out and took her hand, finding it ice cold despite the summer heat. We squeezed simultaneously, offering and receiving comfort through simple human contact that transcended our brief acquaintance. "My brother told me about you," Isabella said quietly, "about how you warned him of an attack at a restaurant, how you saved his life by recognizing patterns others missed. He said you were brave and brilliant and completely untrained for the world you'd walked into." The description was more generous than accurate, but I appreciated the attempt to distract both of us from our immediate danger. "I said you were worth the risk. I meant it." Her eyes filled with tears that she blinked back with determination. "I thought I could change him. My husband, I mean. When we first married, he was attentive and romantic and made me feel cherished. The violence started small. Comments about my appearance or my friends that seemed like caring concern but were actually control. By the time I realized what he was, leaving felt impossible. The familiar pattern of her story resonated with my own experience in ways that created painful solidarity. Marcus had followed the same playbook, incremental escalation that normalized abuse until violence felt like inevitable part of relationship dynamics rather than crisis requiring intervention. "Did he ever threaten your family?" I asked, remembering how Marcus had used potential harm to my sister as leverage to keep me compliant. "Constantly," Isabella confirmed. "He knew the quickest way to control me was threatening my brother. Said if I told anyone about the violence, he'd go after my family's businesses and interests. Make it look like accidents, but ensure everyone understood it was retaliation for my betrayal. But you left anyway." "Because staying meant dying," Isabella said with bleak certainty. "Not dramatically or quickly, but slowly eroded until nothing remained of the person I used to be. At some point, the fear of what he'd do if I stayed became greater than the fear of what he'd do if I left." The van's sudden swerve interrupted our conversation, the driver cursing in Italian as he navigated around a fallen tree branch that partially blocked the narrow road. Behind us, through the rear window, I could see headlights gaining ground, multiple vehicles now coordinating pursuit with professional efficiency. "How many are following us?" our driver asked his partner, who was monitoring something on a tablet that looked like tactical tracking software. "At least 3 vehicles, possibly 4, came the terse reply. "They're coordinating through multiple approach routes, trying to box us in before we reach the mountains." The driver made a decision, pulling off the paved road onto what appeared to be little more than a tractor path through vineyard terraces. The van bounced over rough terrain, suspension protesting the abuse while we clung to whatever handholds we could find. But the maneuver bought us temporary advantage, putting agricultural land between us and the pursuit vehicles that were designed for roads rather than off-road capability. We stayed on that rough terrain for nearly 20 minutes, climbing steadily higher into foothills that would eventually become the Alps. The lake fell away behind us, glittering in evening sun like scattered diamonds. Under different circumstances, the view would have been breathtaking. Instead, it represented increasing distance from help and resources, growing isolation that made interception more dangerous but also less likely to involve civilian casualties. When we finally rejoined paved roads, it was a single-lane mountain route that twisted through forests with the kind of hairpin turns that required complete focus from the driver. The pursuit had fallen back, apparently losing us during our cross-country detour, but our driver maintained punishing speed despite the dangerous curves. Border crossing is 10 kilometers ahead, he announced, checking his mirrors with paranoid frequency. Small checkpoint, minimal staff. We have arrangement with the guards, but only if we arrive before the Italian authorities are alerted to watch for us. Can we make it in time? Isabella asked, voicing the question I'd been afraid to speak. If the pursuit hasn't coordinated with local police, yes, the driver said. If they have, we improvise. The word improvise in the context of armed pursuit and international border crossing felt terrifyingly inadequate. But we had no choice except to trust the extraction team, expertise, and hope that Mr. Russo's resources extended far enough to protect us even here in hostile territory. The checkpoint appeared around a curve with minimal warning, a small building flanked by gates and barriers that could be raised or lowered to control traffic flow. Two guards in Swiss uniforms waited at the crossing, their relaxed posture suggesting they weren't expecting trouble. Our driver slowed to appropriate checkpoint speed, windows already lowered to facilitate conversation. One of the guards approached with professional courtesy, his expression neutral but not hostile as he gestured for our document. The driver handed over a folder containing passports and what I assumed were the arranged permissions Mr. Russo had secured through whatever networks he maintained in Switzerland. The guard reviewed everything with methodical attention, occasionally glancing up to compare faces in the van to photos in the documents. When his gaze settled on Isabella, I saw recognition flicker across his features, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. He knew who she was, understood what this crossing represented, and had been briefed to facilitate our passage without questions that might require uncomfortable answers. Everything appears in order, he said finally in accented English, returning the folder to our driver. Welcome to Switzerland. I hope you enjoy your stay. The barrier lifted with mechanical precision, and we crossed from Italian territory into Swiss jurisdiction in the space of heartbeats. The transition should have felt momentous, dramatic, some clear demarcation between danger and safety. Instead, it was simply pavement continuing across an invisible line, the landscape unchanged despite the profound shift in our legal status and security situation. Isabella made a sound that might have been sob or laugh or both, her whole body sagging with relief so profound it seemed to erase the tension that had defined her posture since we'd met. I reached over and gripped her hand again, sharing in the moment of triumph, even as my practical mind cataloged all the ways our mission could still go wrong. We're not safe yet, our driver cautioned, apparently reading my thoughts. Her husband's people can't pursue us into Switzerland legally, but that doesn't mean they won't try through unofficial channels. We proceed to the safe house in Geneva as quickly as possible without drawing attention. The drive from the border to Geneva took another hour and 40 minutes, winding through mountain passes and lakeside roads that showcased Switzerland's famous beauty. Isabella stared out the window like someone seeing the world for the first time, tears streaming down her face unchecked as she processed the reality of escape she'd barely dared to hope for. Tell me about my brother, she said eventually, turning to face me with eyes that held complicated emotions. You see him every day. Is he happy? Is he safe? Does he ever talk about our mother? The questions revealed depths of concern that transcended her own crisis, sibling love that had survived geographic separation and different life choices. He talks about your mother often, I said honestly, about how brilliant she was, how she deserved better than what your father gave her. I think saving you represents a chance to rewrite that history, to prove that this time he was strong enough to protect the woman he loved. And is he happy? Isabella pressed, needing to know that her brother had found some peace despite the violent world he inhabited. I don't know if happy is the right word, I admitted. He's successful, powerful, surrounded by people who respect and fear him in equal measure. But there's loneliness underneath all that control, like he's built walls so high that genuine connection became impossible. Until recently, anyway. Something in my tone made Isabella study me with sharp attention. Recently, as in when you started working for him? Heat crept up my neck despite my best efforts to maintain composure. I'm just staff. He's been kind about helping me leave my own difficult situation, but that's employer compassion, not personal interest. Sophia, Isabella said with gentle amusement, my brother doesn't help staff escape abusive marriages. He pays them well, treats them fairly, but he doesn't personally intervene in their lives unless they matter to him beyond professional capacity. Whatever is developing between you, it's more than employer and employee. The suggestion hung in the air between us, forcing me to confront feelings I'd been carefully avoiding. My attraction to Mr. Russo had been growing for months, complicated by my marriage to Marcus and the power dynamics inherent in our relationship. But somewhere between him discovering my bruises and sending me to extract his sister from danger, we'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The question was what that meant once we returned to normal life. The safe house in Geneva was an apartment in an upscale building overlooking the lake, all modern minimalism and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. Valentina waited inside, her expression showing relief when we entered without pursuit trailing behind us. "Successful extraction," she said, pulling Isabella into an embrace that suggested their relationship went beyond professional coordination. "You scared me when the timeline compressed. I thought we'd lose you." "I'm harder to kill than my husband anticipated," Isabella replied with dark humor that didn't quite conceal her exhaustion. "Thanks to Sophia's help and your planning, I'm here instead of in a morgue." Valentina turned her attention to me, those sharp eyes conducting assessment that made me feel suddenly uncomfortably visible. "You did well for someone with no training. Most civilians panic under pressure, but you maintained operational focus throughout." Russo chose his asset wisely. "I'm not his asset," I said, though the protest felt weak even to my own ears. "I'm someone who owed him for his help and wanted to return the favor." "Keep telling yourself that," Valentina said with knowing smile. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." I stayed in Geneva for 2 additional days while Valentina finalized Isabella's documentation and security arrangements. The new identity she'd receive would allow her to disappear completely, building a life free from her husband's reach. She'd chosen Vancouver as her destination, far enough from Europe that tracking her would require resources her husband couldn't sustain indefinitely. On my final morning in Switzerland, Isabella and I shared breakfast on the apartment's balcony, watching sunlight paint the lake in shades of gold and rose that seemed almost artificially beautiful. "Thank you," Isabella said quietly, setting down her coffee cup to meet my eyes directly. "It's not just for the extraction, but for caring enough about my brother to risk yourself for his family. He's been alone for so long, isolated by the life he's chosen. Seeing him develop genuine connection with someone gives me hope that he might find happiness beyond power and control." "I don't know what will happen when I return," I admitted. "My situation with Marcus isn't resolved. My own life is complicated in ways that make relationship with your brother seem impossible, even if he wanted one." "Life is always complicated," Isabella observed with wisdom that seemed earned rather than theoretical. "The question is whether the complications are worth navigating for what you might build together. From what Valentina tells me, my brother has been different since you've entered his life. More engaged, more human, less willing to sacrifice everything for strategic advantage." "That's not nothing." The flight back to Chicago was smoother than my outbound journey, though no less anxiety-inducing. I'd successfully completed my first international extraction operation, helped save Isabella from violence that would have eventually killed her, and proven to myself that I was capable of courage I'd never suspected existed beneath years of conditioning to accept abuse. Russo met me at the airport personally, abandoning whatever responsibilities normally occupied his time to stand in arrivals with expression that transformed from controlled concern to pure relief when I emerged from customs. Before I could process what was happening, his arms had wrapped around me in an embrace that had nothing to do with employer greeting employee and everything to do with barely restrained emotion finding outlet. "You're safe," he said against my hair, his voice rough with feelings he usually kept locked away. "Thank God you're safe." "Isabella is secure in Geneva," I reported, trying to maintain some professional distance despite the intimacy of his embrace. "New identity finalized. Departure for Vancouver scheduled for next week. Your sister is free. Because of you," he said, pulling back enough to study my face with intensity that made breathing difficult. "Because you volunteered for dangerous work you had no obligation to accept. Because you risked yourself for my family. I owed you," I said simply, "for the help with Marcus, for seeing my situation when I was too broken to recognize it myself. This was how I could repay that debt." "There is no debt between us," Mr. Russo said with quiet certainty. "There's only two people who recognize in each other the damage that violence leaves behind and the determination to prevent it from continuing. Everything else is just details we'll figure out together." The word "together" hung in the air between us, weighted with implications neither of us was quite ready to fully examine. But before we could continue the conversation, his phone buzzed with incoming message that made his expression shift from tender to coldly satisfied. "It's done," he said, showing me the screen briefly enough to see confirmation without revealing operational details. "Marcus has been appropriately educated about boundaries and consequences. He won't be troubling you anymore." The clinical phrasing should have prompted questions about methodology and ethics, but exhaustion and relief made moral examination feel less urgent than simple gratitude. Whatever Mr. Russo's people had done, whatever conversation they'd had with Marcus, it meant I could finally stop looking over my shoulder with constant fear. "What happens now?" I asked as we walked toward his waiting car. "Now you rest," he said, his hand finding the small of my back with proprietary gentleness. "You recover from international extraction operations you should never have been involved in. And when you're ready, We discuss what comes next for both of us. The drive back to the estate felt like returning home in ways my apartment with Marcus never had. Mrs. Chun greeted me with warm embrace and promises of my favorite meals. The other staff welcomed me back with genuine pleasure that suggested I'd somehow graduated from employee to family member during my absence. And through it all, Mr. Russo stayed close, his presence a constant reminder that protection didn't require possession, that care could exist without control. 3 weeks after returning from Geneva, I finally worked up the courage to visit the apartment I'd shared with Marcus. Mr. Russo insisted on accompanying me despite my protests about handling it myself, and I found myself grateful for his presence when we pulled up to the building that had been my prison for the final year of my marriage. The apartment was empty, not just of Marcus, but of everything. Furniture gone, dishes packed away, even the curtains removed from the windows. Only a single envelope sat on the kitchen counter where I'd spent countless mornings covering bruises with makeup and pretending everything was fine. Inside the envelope was a brief note in handwriting I didn't recognize, clearly written by someone following Marcus's dictation. Papers signed, divorce finalized. I've relocated for work. Don't try to find me. Don't contact me. We're done. The paperwork beneath the note confirmed what the message stated. Marcus had signed away all claims to our shared property, dissolved our marriage without contest, and apparently left Illinois entirely. The speed and completeness of the dissolution spoke to the effectiveness of whatever conversation Mr. Russo's people had conducted with him. He's in Nevada working construction, Mr. Russo said quietly, answering the question I hadn't asked, rebuilding his life far from here with strong incentive never to return or attempt contact. He understood very clearly that his continued well-being depends on respecting your boundaries permanently. What did your people do to him? I asked, needing to know even if the answer made me uncomfortable. They showed him photographs of what men who hurt women under my protection look like when they're found, Mr. Russo said with the clinical detachment he brought to violence. They explained in detail what would happen if he ever contacted you again, ever spoke your name, ever thought about revenge, and they made it clear that Nevada was generous relocation compared to the alternatives I was considering. The casual mention of lethal alternatives should have horrified me. Instead, I felt only relief that Marcus was gone, that the threat he'd represented had been neutralized permanently through methods the legal system could never achieve. Maybe that made me complicit in violence, made me morally compromised, but freedom from constant fear felt worth whatever ethical complications came with it. We spent the afternoon collecting the few possessions I wanted to keep from my old life. Photographs of my mother, books I'd collected over years, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. Everything else, the physical evidence of 5 years with Marcus, I left behind without regret. That life was over, and I felt no need to preserve artifacts from it. Back at the estate that evening, Mr. Russo found me in the garden where I'd been sitting for an hour trying to process the finality of my marriage's end. He settled beside me on the stone bench, close enough that our shoulders touched, his presence warm and solid and entirely unlike Marcus's volatile energy. "You've been quiet since we returned," he observed. "Regrets about how things ended?" "No regrets," I said honestly, just processing how quickly everything changed. 3 weeks ago, I was trapped in abusive marriage I couldn't imagine escaping. Now I'm divorced, Marcus is gone, and I've somehow become involved in international extraction operations. It's a lot to absorb. You've also become important to me in ways I'm still learning to articulate," Mr. Russo said, his hand finding mine with the careful gentleness that characterized all his touch. "What started as employer concern has developed into something more complicated, more personal. I need to know if you feel the same way or if I'm projecting feelings you don't share." The directness of his question deserved honest answer. "I've been attracted to you since I started working here," I admitted, the confession feeling both terrifying and liberating. "But I was married and you were my employer, and acknowledging those feelings felt impossible. Now everything's different and I don't know how to navigate what this becomes." "We navigate it together," Mr. Russo said, echoing the word that had become significant between us. "No pressure, no expectations beyond mutual honesty. You've been through trauma that requires time to process. I'm patient enough to wait while you heal. What if I don't want to wait?" The question emerged before I could second-guess the impulse. What if I'm tired of letting fear dictate my choices? What if I want to explore this connection despite all the complications? His smile was warm and genuine in ways I'd rarely seen, transforming his usually controlled features into something more human and accessible. "Then we explore it," he said simply, "but on your terms, at your pace, with complete freedom to change your mind without consequences to your employment or security." The careful way he established boundaries, ensuring I understood I had power in whatever developed between us, felt like antidote to years of Marcus's controlling behavior. This wasn't man trying to possess me. This was partner offering to walk beside me while I rebuilt myself into someone stronger than trauma had left me. We took things slowly over the following months, building relationship on foundation of mutual respect and honest communication that felt revolutionary after my marriage to Marcus. Mr. Russo never pushed, never demanded more than I was ready to give, never used his power or resources to manipulate my choices. He simply existed as constant presence, supportive when I needed support, giving space when I needed solitude, patient with the healing process that had no predetermined timeline. The nightmares came less frequently as weeks turned into months. The hypervigilance that had characterized my existence with Marcus gradually relaxed into normal awareness. The bruises faded completely, leaving only psychological scars that would require more time to heal but no longer dominated every moment of my existence. My role in the household evolved beyond simple domestic work. Mr. Russo recognized skills I'd demonstrated during Isabella's extraction, my ability to read people and situations, my calm under pressure, my strategic thinking when faced with complex problems. He began including me in discussions about his operations, valuing my perspective on behavioral patterns and risk assessment. I became consultant rather than just staff, partner in his world rather than observer from the margins. Isabella called regularly from Vancouver, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each conversation. She'd found work at an art gallery, started dating a kind man who knew nothing about her past, built life defined by her choices rather than others' control. Her success felt like preview of possibilities. Proof that women could survive violence and build something beautiful from the wreckage. 6 months after returning from Geneva, Mr. Russo proposed, not with dramatic public gesture or expensive restaurant scene, but quietly in the garden where we'd first discussed our feelings. He offered partnership rather than traditional marriage, relationship built on equality and mutual protection rather than ownership and control. I said yes without hesitation, recognizing that what we'd built together was worth whatever risks came with loving man whose world operated in shadows. He'd saved me from Marcus, I'd saved his sister from similar fate. And together we'd created something that transcended the violence that had brought us together. Our wedding was small, intimate, held in the estate's chapel with only closest family and trusted associates in attendance. Isabella flew in from Vancouver, radiant in ways that erased memories of the frightened woman I'd extracted from Milan. Lamar's Chun cried openly, happy tears for the daughter figure she'd watched transform from broken to whole. And through it all, Mr. Russo's hand never left mine. Constant reminder that I'd chosen partner rather than captor, love rather than fear. Standing at the altar exchanging vows, I thought about the woman I'd been the morning Mr. Russo discovered my bruises. Frightened, trapped, convinced that survival was the best I could hope for. That woman felt like stranger now, someone I'd left behind along with the makeup that covered violence and the excuses that enabled it. The woman I'd become was stronger, braver, more complete than I'd ever imagined possible. I'd extracted a woman from danger in foreign country, ended my abusive marriage, fallen in love with man powerful enough to protect me without possessing me. I'd learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that accepting help wasn't failure, that building life worth living sometimes required destroying everything that came before. As Mr. Russo slipped the wedding ring onto my finger, his eyes held promise I finally trusted completely. Promise of partnership without possession, protection without control, love without violence. Promise that the bruises hidden beneath makeup that morning 6 months earlier would be the last ones I ever wore. We kissed as married couple while our small gathering applauded, and I felt something in my chest that had been locked away for years finally break free. Not dramatic or Hollywood perfect, just quiet certainty that I'd found my way to safety, that the hiding was over, that whatever came next we'd face together. That night, standing at the window of our bedroom overlooking the estate grounds, Mr. Russo's arms wrapped around me from behind an embrace that felt like coming home. In the distance, lights glowed from the staff quarters where Mrs. Chun and others slept safely under protection that extended to everyone in our household. Beyond the walls, the world continued its dangerous rhythms, violence and cruelty in 1,000 ways people hurt each other. But here, within these walls, we'd created sanctuary. Not perfect or uncomplicated, built partially on power that operated outside legal boundaries, but ours. And safe, and defined by choice rather than compulsion. I'd entered this house as frightened maid covering bruises with makeup. I'd leave it eventually as a woman who'd learned her own strength, found love that healed rather than harmed, built life worth protecting. The journey from victim to survivor to something more had been shorter than expected, but harder than anyone could anticipate. Looking back at who I'd been, forward to who I was becoming, I finally understood that salvation rarely looked like we expected. Sometimes it wore expensive suits and carried power and quiet voices. Sometimes it required international extraction operations and conversations that made abusers disappear. Sometimes it meant accepting help from dangerous men who understood violence intimately enough to wield it in service of protection. And sometimes in the end it meant standing in your own home with your chosen partner, finally free from fear, finally ready to build rather than just survive. The bruises were gone, the makeup was unnecessary, and the woman reflected in the window glass was someone I'd learned to recognize as myself, fully and without apology. The Mafia boss who'd seen his maid covering bruises had made her husband disappear. But more importantly, he'd helped her discover she was never just a maid, never just a victim, never just someone who needed saving. She was survivor, partner, someone capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it, and together they'd built something that honored both their pasts while creating future neither had dared to imagine.